Ever wonder if those massive shifts in history, the ones that seem to erupt out of nowhere, actually had some kind of underlying strategy?
It's a great question.
Today we're diving deep into the travels of Paul and asking, were his missionary journeys a meticulously planned campaign? Or, something more dynamic and adaptable? You send over some fascinating stuff on this, so let's get right into it.
Yeah, absolutely. We're exploring the strategic elements, or perhaps the lack thereof, in Paul's mission to spread early Christianity. The material you provided, well, it presents compelling arguments on both sides.
Right.
Was there a predetermined route or not?
Right.
We'll be focusing on key texts, like Acts and his letter to the Galatians, to sort of understand this complex picture.
Exactly. Because figuring out whether Paul was operating with a detailed blueprint or was more, let's say, reactive, that gives us a crucial perspective, doesn't it? On how one of history's most influential movements actually gained momentum. It's really about understanding the why behind early Christianity's spread. So where do we even begin to unravel this question of strategy?
Well, okay, an initial argument for a deliberate plan often centers on this recurring phrase in Acts,
The work.
the work.
Okay.
Yeah. Like in Acts 13.2, the Holy Spirit says, "Set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I have called them."
Uh-huh.
Then later, Acts 14.26 talks about their return to Antioch, where they'd been committed to the grace of God for the work they had now completed.
Completed. Interesting.
And remember Acts 15.38, Paul's disagreement with Mark. It stems from Mark not wanting to accompany them to the work.
Okay, so yeah, at first glance, that does sound like they were all on the same page about a specific defined task. The work suggests a pre-agreed objective, right? And Mark leaving is even framed like deserting that specific undertaking.
That's certainly one interpretation. It makes sense on the surface. However, this idea of a really rigid, fixed plan, it faces some significant challenges. Think about Professor Ramsey, the prominent New Testament scholar.
I know the name.
His argument connecting the Galatian letter to the churches Paul founded in South Galatia, that's key here. Because if Ramsey's are right, then Paul's own account in Galatians itself introduces a really crucial counterpoint.
How so? What does Paul actually say in Galatians that challenges this?
Well, in Galatians 4.13, Paul writes, and this is pretty direct, "You know that it was because of a physical illness that I first preached the gospel to you."
Because of an illness.
Exactly. It implies his initial preaching there in Galatia wasn't like stop number 5 on a pre-planned itinerary. It seems it happened because a health issue either forced him to go there or maybe just delayed him there long enough to start preaching. An unplanned detour, essentially.
So not a deliberate strategic choice at all, but more like a consequence of being sick that then turned into an opportunity. That definitely complicates the idea of a meticulously laid out plan right from the get-go.
It really does.
And Ramsey connecting that letter to those churches founded on this, well, unplanned stop, that's a pretty important link, isn't it?
Precisely. If those Galatian communities, the ones he's writing to, actually arose from this unexpected situation, it makes it much harder to argue for a strict, predetermined plan guiding every single move from the start.
So what about the work then? How does that fit?
Well, it's quite plausible, isn't it, that the work mentioned in Acts actually refers more broadly to the overall mission.
You mean like the general task of spreading the gospel?
Yeah, exactly. The overarching aim, rather than a super detailed itinerary with, specific goals mapped out for every single location.
That makes sense. The big picture goal, the work could be that, and the specifics of how and where that unfolded were maybe more flexible. But then, hang on, we do see instances where Paul seems to have a pretty clear direction in mind, don't we? Like in Acts 15.
Yes, absolutely. You're right. In Acts 15.36, Paul actually proposes revisiting the cities where they had previously preached. He says, "Let us go back and visit the believers in all the towns where we proclaimed the word of the Lord to see how they're doing."
Right. Which clearly shows a desire for follow-up, sort of nurturing the communities they'd already started.
Definitely a strategic element there, follow through.
And the text even indicates his intended route after making that decision, doesn't it?
It does. Acts 15.41 tells us Paul traveled through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. And it mentions his intention was Cilicia, then South Galatia, and then heading on towards Ephesus. So, yes, there's evidence of planned destinations.
Okay, so there's planning, but then the Holy Spirit seems to step in and, well, redirect things pretty dramatically. This is where it gets really interesting, I think, this interplay between Paul's own intentions and what seems like divine guidance.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. Acts 16 recounts how Paul tried to preach in the province of Asia,
Right.
but was prevented by the Holy Spirit. Then He tries to enter Bithynia, and again, the Spirit says no, basically. Wouldn't allow it.
Wow, blocked twice.
Yeah. And this leads him to Troas. And it's there he has that famous vision, the man from Macedonia calling him over,
The Macedonian call.
which prompts his journey there instead of where he'd maybe intended.
Talk about a significant change of plans. That's huge. So it seems he had a direction in mind, Asia, Bithynia maybe. Yet he was also remarkably open to what he perceived as God's direction. Right?
Extremely open, even if it meant completely scrapping his intended route.
What about his time in Athens, though? That seems like maybe a slightly different kind of situation.
Yeah, Athens feels a bit different. It seems to have been more of an interim stop. After the intense experiences in Philippi, Thessalonica, and Berea, he seems to have sought refuge in Athens, waiting for Silas and Timothy.
Kind of regrouping.
Possibly.
Mm-hmm.
The source material suggests he didn't really aim to establish a long-term church base there, but used it more as a temporary base.
Okay.
And his next move, the journey to Corinth, it's presented either as just the most logical next step geographically, or perhaps another instance of divine prompting. We don't know for sure.
So a mix, maybe. Practical considerations, perceived spiritual guidance, all shaping his movements.
Seems likely.
And then we get to Ephesus, which feels like it was a really pivotal location for him.
Ephesus was definitely significant. Acts 18 describes his first visit. It was brief, actually, just passing through on his way to Jerusalem.
Oh, right. Just a quick stop initially.
Yeah, but he found a receptive audience there. And because of that, he promised to return if God willed it. So that indicates he recognized the potential there and made a deliberate decision to prioritize it later on.
Which he then does on his third journey, correct? So that's when we start seeing more concrete evidence of like actual pre-planning.
Yes, exactly. Paul's third missionary journey, which we'll read about mainly in Acts 19, definitely reveals a greater degree of forethought.
While he's based in Ephesus for quite a while, he explicitly states his plan. Travel through Macedonia and Achaia, then go to Jerusalem. And then he declares, after I've gone there, I must also see Rome, Acts 19.21.
Rome. Okay, that's the first time he clearly articulates that big long-term strategic ambition, isn't it?
It really is.
Yeah.
A major goal stated up front. So it almost looks like his approach sort of evolved over time. Maybe the earlier journeys were a bit more exploratory, feeling things out. And then as he gained experience, as the movement grew, his planning became, well, more structured, more long range.
That's a very plausible way to see it. Now, the material you shared also raises this fascinating point about focusing on provinces, not just individual cities.
Oh, yeah. Tell me about that. That caught my eye, too.
What's really interesting is how often both Luke in Acts and Paul himself seem to refer to the Roman provinces as the key unit.
Not just the city names.
Not always, no. For example, remember when he was stopped from preaching in the province of Asia?
Right.
And then he was called to the province of Macedonia.
Ah.
And think about the collection for Jerusalem. Paul boasts to the Christians in the province of Macedonia about the readiness of those in the province of Achaia.
Okay, yeah, I see the pattern. So the primary geographical unit seems bigger than just the specific towns. What's the significance of focusing on the province level?
Well, the implication is that Paul likely saw the Roman province as the key strategic area for evangelization. His work largely happened within the administrative boundaries set up by the Roman Empire. And the source highlights, for instance, that when he was preaching in South Galatia, he was evangelizing a Roman province right next to his home province of Cilicia, where there were already Christians.
Okay, makes sense geographically.
But interestingly, it looks like he might have bypassed the region of Lycaonia, which was situated between them.
Really? Why?
It suggests, possibly, a deliberate weighing up of which provinces held greater strategic value, or perhaps offered better conditions for spreading the gospel effectively.
So it wasn't just about hitting as many towns as possible randomly. It was about focusing on these larger administrative units that maybe offered better reach or infrastructure for the message to spread.
That seems to be the idea.
And this ties into his strategy of establishing centers, right? Not trying to be everywhere himself.
Absolutely. Paul's approach wasn't about him personally preaching in every single town and village across a province. That would be impossible. Instead, he focused on establishing what the source calls centers of Christian life.
Centers of Christian life, like key churches.
Yeah, basically key congregations in maybe 2 or 3 strategically important cities within that province.
Okay.
And the idea was, from these central locations, the message would then naturally spread outwards, into the surrounding towns and rural areas.
Like a hub-and-spoke model, almost, for spiritual influence.
That's a great way to put it. The goal wasn't just to have a church in Corinth or in Ephesus, but for that church to become a center of light for the whole region around it.
Right, and this connects back to that powerful statement Paul makes in Romans 15, doesn't it? Where he says he's basically filled the area from Jerusalem to Illyricum with the gospel.
Exactly, Romans 15:19. He claims that after about a decade of ministry, starting from Antioch, he had fully proclaimed the gospel all the way around to Illyricum.
Which is a huge area.
Massive. And he says he feels like he has no more place to work in these regions.
How could he say that if he hadn't visited every town?
Because, the thinking goes, by successfully establishing these vibrant, influential churches in the key centers of each province, he had, in essence, reached the entire province. The seeds were planted in the most strategic soil.
That's a really insightful way to think about it. Strategic focus leading to widespread impact, even without him being physically everywhere.
It's just a clear methodology.
Now, what kind of cities did he tend to choose for these centers? Was there a particular profile? Did they have things in common?
There does seem to be a pattern, yes. The source material points to about 4 main characteristics that these cities often shared.
Okay, let's hear them.
Firstly, they were often centers of Roman administration.
Ah, the political centers. Why was that important?
Well, it provided a degree of security, a known legal framework, and also the very idea of a huge worldwide empire with common citizenship that perhaps prepared minds for a universal message like the gospel.
Interesting parallel.
Plus, the contrast in how Paul was sometimes treated often better by the overarching Roman authorities than by local mobs or officials might also be relevant.
Okay, so Roman administration is one. What's the second characteristic?
Secondly, these cities were centers of Greek civilization, Hellenistic culture, meaning a common language, Koine Greek, which was absolutely vital for communication, right? And for understanding the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament everyone was using.
The common language, yeah, that seems crucial for a movement trying to cross cultural lines.
Definitely. And Greek culture also emphasized education, learning, intellectual discussion, which kind of aligns well with Christianity being a faith based on scriptures, teaching, and being able to articulate your beliefs.
So a culture open to learning and reasoned argument.
Exactly. Even ordinary Christians were sort of expected to engage intellectually with their faith.
Makes sense. Okay, Roman admin, Greek culture. What's number 3?
Thirdly, nearly all these key cities were centers of Jewish influence. They had significant Jewish populations and synagogues.
Right. Paul always went to the synagogue first, didn't he?
Usually, yes. It gave him an initial point of contact, an audience already familiar with the God of Israel, the scriptures, messianic expectation, the foundational concepts.
Starting on familiar ground before reaching out wider.
Precisely. And the Jewish community also had a reputation for, strict morality and religious seriousness, which created a certain context for his message.
Okay. And the final characteristic, the 4th one.
Finally, these were centers of world commerce, major trade hubs.
Ah, the economic angle.
Yeah. These cities weren't just local market towns. They often held leadership roles within their provinces, influencing trade, policy ideas. They had a broader perspective.
Connected to the wider world.
Exactly. Connected through extensive trade routes, land and sea. These cities were like keys to major roads and shipping lanes, which naturally helped the movement of people and ideas, including the Christian message.
So it's this powerful combination: Roman administration, Greek culture, Jewish presence, and global commerce. Quite a strategic mix.
It really is.
But the material also warns us not to treat this like some kind of rigid formula, doesn't it? It wasn't just about ticking those 4 boxes.
Exactly right. It's a crucial nuance. Many cities back then probably had several of these characteristics. Paul didn't just, pull out a checklist and pick the highest scoring cities.
So other factors were involved.
Absolutely. The text constantly emphasizes the role of the Holy Spirit in guiding his path. Remember being blocked from Asia and Bithynia.
Right, and the Macedonian call?
Yeah. And think about Berea in Macedonia. The Bereans were famously receptive. But Berea wasn't nearly as prominent a city as, say, Pella, the old capital, yet he had significant success there.
Ah, good point.
So while these cities had natural advantages, they became truly strategic centers for the mission because of what Paul did there, because of the vibrant communities he fostered.
It wasn't just the location, it was what he made of the location.
Precisely. They were starting points for outreach, launch pads, not necessarily final destinations in themselves.
Right. It wasn't just about planting a flag in a quote-unquote strategic place and then expecting the whole region to magically convert.
No, not at all.
It required active work, empowering the local believers, ensuring they carried the message outwards. And the material even contrasts this with some modern approaches, doesn't it?
Yes, it draws a contrast with what it calls modern, concentrated missions at great centers.
What's the potential pitfall there, according to the source?
The danger, it suggests, is focusing only on capturing these strategic points, these big cities, without ensuring that vital outflow of life.
The outflow, meaning the message actually spreading from there.
Exactly. Making sure the local converts themselves become active in propagating the faith outwards. Without that, the source uses some pretty strong metaphors.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
It says these concentrated centers can become like prisons or safes or stagnant swamps, basically holding potential and containing it.
Instead of letting it flow out.
Right, instead of being like vibrant mints producing currency, or flowing springs providing water, or busy railway stations facilitating movement and connection outwards.
Wow, those are powerful images. Prisons and swamps versus springs and stations.
They really are. It underlines the idea that Paul's success wasn't just in picking strategic spots, but in his strategy within those spots, transforming them into dynamic sources of outward influence.
Empowering the local communities to be self-sustaining and, crucially, mission-focused themselves.
That seems to be the core of it. Paul's centers were designed to be dynamic hubs, radiating outwards, not just static outposts collecting people. He chose advantageous locations because he had a plan for how the gospel would then spread from there.
Okay, so if we try to synthesize all this, it looks like Paul probably operated with some initial intentions, maybe some broad plans, particularly later on, but he was also incredibly adaptable, highly responsive to circumstances, and crucially, to what he believed was divine guidance from the Holy Spirit.
Seems fair.
But his real genius, perhaps, wasn't just the route he took, but how he recognized and then leveraged the inherent advantages of the places he was led to, transforming them into these vibrant, outward-looking hubs for the early Christian movement. It wasn't merely about being in the right place, but about making it the right place for the gospel to take root, flourish, and then spread.
That sums it up beautifully, I think. His method wasn't just about geographical selection. It was fundamentally about cultivating communities that would become self-replicating sources of faith and mission.
So for you, the listener, as you think about Paul's incredible journeys and this mix of planning and responsiveness, maybe consider this. In your own life, your own projects or goals, how do you strike that balance? How do you balance the need for strategic planning with that equally vital ability to be flexible, to adapt when things don't go as expected, or when new opportunities or even apparent obstacles arise?
It's constant tension, isn't it?
It really is. And maybe think, too, about what it truly means to cultivate a center of influence, whether that's in your personal life, your work, your community. What does it take to create something that doesn't just exist, but actively extends its message, its values, its impact beyond its immediate boundaries, like those springs and railway stations, not the swamps?
A compelling question to leave people with.